For over 3 decades, one comedian's grinning face and a burst of frantic saxophone music meant the same thing to television audiences across the world. It was time to laugh, guilt-free, at the fastest, silliest, most shamelessly cheeky show on the air. Benny Hill built an empire on slapstick double entendres, and a chase scene so iconic it became a cultural shorthand of its own. But by the end of the 1980s, the same show that had once been celebrated as harmless fun found itself at the center of a genuine cultural argument, one that didn't just embarrass a fading program, but helped end it for good. To understand how that happened, you have to start with the unlikely, hard-working life of the man behind it. A modest start in Southampton. Alfred Hawthorne Hill was born in Southampton, England, in January 1924, into a family with an odd mix of practicality and performance running through it. His father ran a surgical appliance shop, a steady, unglamorous trade, while his grandfather had once worked as a circus clown, a detail that feels almost too fitting given what young Alfred would eventually become. He attended a local grammar school, but nothing about his early education pointed toward show business. Before he ever stepped in front of an audience professionally, he worked as a shop assistant, a milkman, a bridge operator, and even briefly as a drummer, picking up odd jobs the way most working-class kids of that era did. His actual break into entertainment came through the back door, as an assistant stage manager with a touring variety review, the kind of unglamorous job that teaches you everything about timing, blocking, and how a live show actually runs. That experience turned out to be more valuable than any formal training could have been. World War II interrupted everything, as it did for most young men of his generation. Hill was called into service in 1942, trained as a mechanic, and eventually served as a truck driver and searchlight operator, seeing deployment in Normandy during the critical months following the Allied invasion. Before the war ended, he was transferred into the Combined Services Entertainment Unit, a division built specifically to keep troop morale up through live performance. It was there, entertaining exhausted soldiers rather than paying theater crowds, that Hill first discovered he had a real gift for making people laugh under difficult conditions. He took the stage name Benny as a tribute to the American comedian Jack Benny, whose dry, precisely timed delivery he admired enormously, finding his voice on radio and early television. After the war, Hill worked his way into British radio, making his debut on the popular program Variety Bandbox in 1947. Radio comedy in that era demanded a very specific kind of writing, since every joke had to land purely on timing and voice, with no visual gag to fall back on. Hill thrived in that format and used it to sharpen the instincts that would define his later work. When television started replacing radio as a dominant entertainment medium in British homes, Hill made the jump early, appearing on TV for the first time in 1950. The visual medium suited him even better than radio had, since it let him lean into the physical comedy, costume changes, and character work that radio simply couldn't showcase. Throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, he experimented constantly, starring in a sketch anthology series where he played a different character every week, and even taking on a genuinely dramatic role in a television adaptation of A Midsummer Night's Dream, proving he had more range than his slapstick reputation suggested. The show begins, the program that would define his career and eventually become the subject of international controversy, premiered on the BBC in January 1955. From its earliest episodes, The Benny Hill Show leaned heavily on the traditions of British music hall entertainment, quick sketches, exaggerated characters, visual gags, and a comfortable willingness to flirt with innuendo without ever fully crossing into anything explicit. Hill wrote much of his own material, often in collaboration with writer Dave Freeman, and built a loyal ensemble of recurring performers around him, including the memorably bald and endlessly patient Jackie Wright, who became famous purely for being on the receiving end of Hill's signature head slap gag. In 1969, the show made a significant jump from the BBC to Thames Television, a move that transformed it from a modest weekly series into an internationally distributed phenomenon. Under Thames, the format shifted toward hour-long specials rather than short weekly episodes, giving Hill more room to build elaborate musical numbers and multi-part sketches. The show was eventually broadcast in well over 100 countries, and its blend of visual comedy translated easily across language barriers in a way that dialogue-heavy sitcoms never could. Two elements became inseparable from the show's identity during this era. The first was the closing chase sequence, a frantic, sped-up sprint through parks, beaches, and city streets involving Hill and a rotating cast of characters, all set to the instrumental track Yakety Sax, which became so tightly associated with the show that audiences simply started calling it the Benny Hill theme. The second was the introduction of Hill's Angels in the 1980s, a troupe of dancers who appeared in musical numbers and comedic sketches alongside Hill, adding a layer of glamour that broadened the show's appeal even as it drew increasing criticism. Cracks beginning to show. By the early 1980s, the show's core formula, built around innuendo, physical gags, and a fairly one-note portrayal of attractive women as objects of pursuit, was still hugely popular with its existing audience, but British comedy itself was changing quickly around it. A new wave of what came to be called alternative comedy was rising through comedians who built their material on social commentary, political satire, and a more critical eye toward the kind of humor Hill represented. Where Hill's generation had built comedy out of music hall tradition and gentle mischief, this new generation increasingly viewed his brand of humor as a relic, one that reinforced outdated and sometimes harmful attitudes rather than simply entertaining. The most vocal and public critic to emerge from that movement was Ben Elton, a comedian closely associated with the alternative comedy scene, who used both his stand-up performances and print interviews to argue that Hill's show trivialized the treatment of women and, in his view, contributed to a broader culture where women were treated as targets of pursuit rather than as people. His criticism landed in a magazine interview and on televised comedy specials, and it struck a nerve precisely because British attitudes toward gender and comedy were shifting rapidly at the same time. The response to Elton's criticism was sharply divided. Some commentators agreed that the show's reliance on ogling and pursuit had aged badly and deserved scrutiny. Others pushed back hard, arguing that blaming a comedy program for broader social problems was an enormous overreach, and that Hill, by then an older, largely apolitical entertainer working in a tradition decades older than alternative comedy itself, was an easy and somewhat unfair target. The debate became public enough that Elton himself later poked fun at his own reputation as a scold, appearing in a sketch parodying an overly self-righteous, politically correct version of himself being chased to the tune of Yakety Sax, a wink at exactly the kind of humor he had criticized. The real reasons behind the cancellation. While the cultural argument over Hill's brand of comedy captured headlines and gave the ending a clean, dramatic narrative, the actual decision to cancel the show in 1989 came down to a mix of factors, only one of which was the shifting cultural mood. Ratings, which had once peaked at more than 21 million viewers in the early 1970s, had been steadily declining through the decade as audience tastes moved toward different styles of comedy. At the same time, production costs had climbed substantially, with each hour-long special reportedly costing several £100,000 to produce, a budget that became increasingly difficult to justify as viewership shrank and advertising revenue softened along with it. Thames Television ultimately let Hill go in 1989, ending a relationship that had lasted 21 years and, according to later reporting, had earned the network tens of millions of pounds over that span, thanks largely to the show's massive success in overseas syndication, particularly in the United States. The controversy over the show's content gave the cancellation a clear public narrative, and it certainly shaped how the ending was covered in the press. But it arrived alongside declining ratings and rising costs that likely would have forced a reckoning regardless of a cultural debate swirling around it. Life after the cameras stopped. Hill didn't retire quietly after losing his signature show. In the early 1990s, he attempted a new project called Benny Hill's World Tour, intending to take his sketch comedy to the countries where the original show had found its biggest overseas audiences. The ambitious format never fully got off the ground, and only one special episode was ever completed, filmed in New York with several of his longtime cast members. That episode would later be marketed as his final television appearance. In February 1992, not long before his death, Thames Television responded to persistent audience demand by airing re-edit compilations of his old episodes, a quiet acknowledgement that the audience for his work hadn't actually disappeared, even if the network's appetite for producing new material had. A private man behind a larger-than-life persona. Away from the cameras, Hill lived in a way that contrasted sharply with his flamboyant on-screen character. Despite substantial personal wealth, he never bought a home, choosing instead to rent modest flats for most of his adult life, including one apartment in London he kept for over 2 decades before eventually moving closer to his production studio. He was famously frugal, known for shopping at ordinary supermarkets, mending his own clothes rather than replacing them, and walking rather than paying for transportation unless someone else was footing the bill. He never married and had no children, having proposed marriage twice in his life to women who both declined. He kept his romantic life almost entirely out of public view, and speculation about his personal relationships followed him throughout his career, none of it ever confirmed by Hill himself, who preferred to keep that part of his life private no matter how much attention his public persona attracted. Hill's health began declining noticeably in the years leading up to his death. In early 1992, he suffered a heart attack, and doctors recommended bypass surgery, which he declined. Shortly afterward, he was diagnosed with kidney failure and chose not to pursue dialysis treatment either. Despite these serious health issues, he continued to live independently in his flat rather than move into assisted care. He died at home in April 1992, at 68 years old, found after several days when phone calls to him went unanswered. He had reportedly been watching television in his armchair at the time. In a detail that reads almost like something from one of his own scripts, a new contract offer from a television network arrived at his home the very same day he died, a piece of professional recognition that came just too late for him to see it. His estate, when it was finally settled, was worth several £1,000,000, but his will, drafted decades earlier, had left everything to his parents, both of whom had died before him. With no updated instructions and no children of his own, the estate ultimately passed to his nieces and nephews, a quietly modest resolution for a man who had spent his career larger than life on screen. What actually remains? More than 3 decades after it went off the air, The Benny Hill Show still occupies an unusual place in television history. It was, at its commercial peak, one of the most watched programs in Britain and one of the most widely exported comedy formats in the world. It was also, by the end of its run, a genuine flashpoint in a real cultural argument about what comedy owes its audience and how much responsibility entertainment carries for the attitudes it reflects back at people. The truth of its ending sits somewhere in the middle of the 2 competing stories that have followed it ever since. It wasn't purely a victim of changing cultural sensitivities, and it wasn't purely a business decision driven by ratings and budgets either. It was both, arriving at the same moment, each reinforcing the other, until a show that had run for over 3 decades finally reached its natural, complicated conclusion.